This is a paper that you'll see some similarities to Argentina. I actually did it because I was working with the government of Ethiopia, but it's kind of, many countries have share the features that I'm going to show you. In essence, the idea is that some countries at some point finance expenditure by printing money. So you like to print money, but you don't like inflation. So what do? You fix exchange rate. And if you print money to finance the government and you fix exchange rate, what's going to happen? The exchange rate regime will blow up like Krugman taught us, right? But the pegger that likes to print the money doesn't like that. So what do? They try to prolong the peg. How do they do it? They put capital control to extend the life of the peg. And I'm going to show you that if you just do that, it collapses. A little bit later, but it collapses nevertheless. So then you're going to put import restrictions so that you don't lose reserves. And that creates all sorts of problems and the economy kind of implodes. So that's the story I want to tell. So it's a very different way of looking at capital controls. We're not playing the game of we're doing optimal policy and the capital control solves some problem. The capital control just keeps the bad policies alive for longer. So when you put the capital I'm going to skip this. I'm going to explain you later. I want to finish early because Federico and I have to catch a plane. So this is the prevalence of multiple exchange rates that are a symptom of capital control from an old paper of Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff. I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures to show you what I have in mind. This is Afghanistan. This is from a database that Ethan Ilsetsky gave me that they put together with Carmen and Ken. So look at okay. Yeah, I have to be able to manage this. So Afghanistan had capital controls for 40 years, okay? I picked it because it's with A, and it's the first one in the database, and it looks kind of nice for what I want to say. Look here, in 1980, like the official and the parallel exchange rate that are the red and the black were the same. The blue, that is the black market premium, is 0. And then the red line that is the official exchange rate is fixed. And this one goes up and up and up and up and up and up. And this is like multiplied by 1,000, okay? In 20 years, they multiply the prices by 1,000. They multiplied by 5 per year. And the exchange rate was fixed, okay? So how can you make that last? This is Peru. I did this yesterday. Whatever I say now, Julio, Paul, and Ariane will tell me that it's wrong, and Roberto. But I think that here, this is a short, but here you see that the black market exchange rate is going up. You have a fixed exchange rate. So here you have it's fixed. Nothing is happening, so they are not printing money. And then here they started to print money, and the shadow exchange rate, you're going to see in the model, is kind of a symptom. This gap is kind of a symptom that you're printing a lot of money. And in some way here, when you devalue, you run out of the reserves, you let it float. and then these gaps were kind of small. It's a very different picture in Peru than in Afghanistan. And many countries have different stories where over lunch talking about interpreting Bolivia that is having a similar situation, but I think that Bolivia is floating now, even though it's a secret. And
so Andy, what's the point of that? The previous plot? What are you trying to say with that one?
With these plots?
No, not Afghanistan.
The Peru?
The Peru. Other than that, it's kind of...
No, okay, that the parallel exchange rate is telling you that you're printing a lot of money and that it eventually collapses. And the parallel exchange rate is also telling you that you're having capital controls. So I'm going to show you models that can explain these things. Now I'm not going to talk about, the other thing I want to tell you is from the Reinhardt and Rogoff table, you see that the countries that have multiple exchange rates have an inflation that is 160, the other one's 20, so the inflation is 8 times higher, and growth instead of being 1.8 is 0.8 higher. And then yesterday I was talking to Federico, who was doing growth regressions when he was younger, and he told me to look at this paper by Barron Lee, where they have the parallel market premium as an explanation of growth, with this coefficient of minus 0.03. The variance of the black market premium was around 20%. So that and they did this with 10-year averages, which means that the black market premium kind of explains that growth falls by 0.6 per year, one standard deviation. There are many problems with these things. They are just correlations. I don't want to say anything about causation or anything of the sort. The only thing I use this as motivating evidence because I want to tell you a story in which at some point the capital controls reduce growth. So I'm going to start explaining how we model capital controls. Then I'm going to do a model of capital controls with free trade. So when you have a free trade and the fixed exchange rate that people anticipate is going to be gone, the capital controls don't allow you to go to a central bank and buy the dollars, but if you have free trade, you can buy imports to get rid of the extra money and grab the reserves. So that's what you do. And then you're going to put import restrictions so that you can not import to grab the reserves. So if you look at the balance of payments identity here, the change in reserves plus the change in the private net of foreign assets is equal to the current account. That's what we teach in our first course of international. And now, typically, these capital controls work that the government tells exporters you have to sell your export proceeds to the central bank, and importers buy from the central bank. So all the current account transactions are settled against the central bank with reserves. And then in the aggregate, the private net capital flows are equal to 0, which does not preclude individuals within the economy to trade foreign assets among ourselves, and that's a black market for the exchange rate. And this was very prevalent in the post-war, and for people like Tim and I, and maybe Roberto, Freddy, that were old enough, we learned the monetary approach to the balance of payments, which said that the balance of payments is not this intertemporal thing that young people think that it is, and it actually is, but And it's definitely not the ISLM BP where the price of non-tradables to tradables determines the current account. But Harry Johnson, Jacob Frenkel, and these guys were saying if the current account is equal to the change in reserves, then I can explain the current account with the change in the demand for money minus the change in domestic credit, which is a discussion we had with Paul before, that if you have the capital controls, the change in reserves comes from the monetary approach to the balance of payments. Okay. So I'm going to use all these results from our forefathers. I'm going to assume that we had a discussion with Manuel because he told me that this is redundant, but I'm going to explain it anyway. Hopefully I will not confuse you as I confuse Manuel. There is this redundant asset that is a Lucas tree that pays a dividend that is the international interest rate every year, and it's a perpetuity. If you discount this with international interest rate, the price it should be 1. So it's $1. Now, we can trade this tree domestically at this price Q in local currency. So this is going to be the price of buying a tree that in normal conditions, if the interest rates are equal across countries, should be $1. But if the interest rates are different, it's not going to be $1. Okay? And then if I divide this floating, this free exchange rate by the fixed exchange rate, I get the premium that I showed you in the previous slides in blue. And I'm going to, if you click here, you're going to see the exchange rate that is implicit in the price of the stock of Apple in the Buenos Aires Stock Exchange and in the New York Stock Exchange and many stocks. And if you click here, you're going to see it for Bitcoin. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to do it. So then, how do you compute this price? You're going to have a nominal interest rate, the fruit times the exchange rate divided by the price of the tree is the dividend as a fraction of the price. And this is the capital gain. This is an arbitrage equation. And then if you solve this, you get the price of Q, of the capital Q. If you subtract the rate of devaluation, that is going to be the rate of inflation with a free trade, then this goes dividing here. This is the premium, and this is the change in the premium. So in the old literature, the capital controls were this thing that I told you. The modern literature says that the difference between this and this is the capital flow management taxes that Loop was showing us that are these. In this paper, they are endogenous. They are the result of the percentage change in the premium and how different this is from one. Okay. And if at some point the fixed exchange regime collapses and you start to float, like you saw in these pictures for Peru, for example, that's what Nico was asking, then the Q is going to be equal to the exchange rate after you have the collapse of the regime, the devaluation discounted at the nominal interest rate, plus the present value of the fruit. So in that sense, the price of the black market is anticipating what's going to happen to the official. And even though in the model it doesn't have it's a redundant asset that doesn't influence the allocations, I think it's interesting to understand it because it allows us to interpret the data. For example, I can tell you that when the nominal black market exchange rate multiplied by 10 in Afghanistan is because they were printing money. Okay. So let's say I'm going to do a very, very simple model. It's essentially the Krugman model. An endowment economy with free trade, the domestic prices are equal to the exchange rate. I'm going to put money in the utility function. And following Krugman, I'm going to make the rate of growth of domestic credit equal to theta. That's a controversial assumption because it means that the budget deficit is growing exponentially. But you can relax it at the cost of messier algebra, and I'm going to follow Krugman here. Even though a deficit that is fixed in real terms might be better than an exponential deficit. And I'm going to say that exchange rate is unsustainable when the rate of devaluation is smaller than the rate of growth of domestic credit. In that case of Afghanistan, the devaluation, the epsilon was equal to 0. Okay. Here it's interesting to understand the budget constraints. The budget constraint, most of the time, is the usual one. The accumulation of assets is equal to income minus consumption minus taxes plus the interest on the foreign assets plus the interest on the nominal bond divided by the exchange rate. Okay. Now, there are these points when the regime changes where in the Krugman model, you have free capital mobility, so agents can increase their holdings of the foreign bonds. The nominal black market and official rate are the same. And the fact that there is no arbitrage, that you cannot make money just by rebalancing the portfolio, is saying that the change in the nominal assets is going to be equal to the change in the foreign currency asset with the flip side. Okay. Now, under capital controls, things are different because you cannot change this. Okay. And because you cannot change this in the aggregate, you cannot change this in the aggregate. When you have the capital controls, the fact that this is equal to 0 means that your nominal holdings before and after the change of regime have to be the same. And also, notice that this is an asset price that is continuous in time, it cannot jump. So even though you have dollars, it's like, if you cannot change this and this is doesn't jump at T, these dollars that you have are like a nominal asset, and when there is a jump in the price level, you have a capital loss. Okay? So when you have this devaluation, you have a jump in the price level, this that is your holding of nominal things is going to have a capital loss. And that's important for the equilibrium. So if you write the wealth accumulation in real terms, the wealth accumulation is equal to the interest on what you had before, but this is at the domestic interest rate. That might be difficult, plus the savings minus the seniorage, okay? And then if you have the capital controls and there is the devaluation that you don't have it in the Krugman model, then on this nominal wealth, you're going to have a capital loss because of the devaluation that is perfectly anticipated, okay? So it's you're holding an asset, you're going to get killed, but there's nothing you can do about it. So The consumer's problem is to maximize the utility. This interest rate is equal to the international rate. So there is no reason to have any capital flows except from the incentives that the inconsistent monetary policy is giving you. This is a standard budget constraint, and this is that the fact that at time t, if you have the Krugman case, this is going to be equal to 0, and this goes away. When you have the capital controls, you're going to get killed. Okay? So when you take the first order conditions, you're going to have the demand for money, marginal rate of substitution between money and consumption. I'm going to do some simple examples in the computer, separate utility, everything beautiful, okay? Everything easy. Then you're going to have the Euler equation, and here the growth of consumption is going to depend on the wedge between the domestic rate and the international rate, that is your discount factor. And then at the time of the regime switch, you're going to have this capital loss, okay? And notice that when you have the devaluation, then if you fix this consumption has to be higher. Okay, so as a refresher, this is a graph of the Krugman model. Here, the red line is consumption. It doesn't move. And that's because the interest rate in the preference, in the country's discount factor is equal to the international interest rate. Now, this is domestic credit. These are the reserves. The sum of domestic credit plus the reserves is a quantity of money. If domestic credit is growing, the quantity of money, the demand for money is fixed because the interest rate is fixed because we have a fixed exchange rate. Reserves are falling, but at some point people will realize that the exchange rate, the fixed exchange rate regime will collapse. You're going to have floating, and with the floating, the rate of inflation is going to be the rate of growth of the money supply with no reserves, that is theta. The demand for money is going to fall, and the demand for money will fall by this amount that is exactly equal to the reserves and is exactly equal to the foreign bonds that the country, the private sector is grabbing from the central bank. And this is the speculative attack, and with our parameters, it's 1.5 years. Now, when you have the capital controls, the consumption after the attack is easy, is the interest on the assets. You don't have reserves, so it's only the private assets, plus income net of expenditures. And the money demand depends on the consumption and the nominal interest rate after the attack. Now, the Euler equation at T is that the marginal rate of substitution between consumption before and after the attack is equal to the return on these nominal assets, that is 1 over the 1 plus the rate of the valuation. And this, because the money supply doesn't change, the jump in prices is equal to the rate of the money demands. The money demand after the attack is the one that we derived before. And this is the supply of money in dollars at the official exchange rate when reserves are 0. And you see that if theta is bigger than epsilon, this thing is growing with the time of the attack. So this thing is becoming smaller. The devaluation will be bigger the more money you have printed over time, which means that the jump in consumption is going to be bigger. And the bigger is this, the more money you printed because of the theta and the time it took you. the larger is going to be the consumption before the attack, because that's a way of taking the reserves out of the central bank by having the trade deficit and getting the reserves. So I'm going to go fast over this equation. This is the Euler condition where
So Andy, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
Sorry. What I didn't follow, I'm sure it's a simple point, is so at this time T,
yeah.
T is when everything breaks and you get out of this kind of, imagine like an inaction region, and now you kind of hit this boundary. No, like kind of it's like the
It's not like DSS. I'm going to tell you how to compute it now.
But my question is, why it has to hold in derivatives and not in the level? What I don't understand is, kind of in the way I'm thinking about it, okay, there's something that has to hold at the moment. It seems that what holds is the Euler equation at that point, but why not the value that we should hold at that point? I don't. Yeah.
You can break the problem in you have a value function.
It looks like a smooth
You have like
thing.
Let's talk about the technicalities later.
Whatever.
There is a way of doing that funny Euler equation, breaking the problem in two. There is one. That's what your question is the reason why Manuel thinks we should do it in discrete time. So this equation here is just the monetary approach to the balance of payments that I showed you before. This is the Euler equation. So this is a system where I replace the real interest rate by the nominal here minus the rate of devaluation is the real. So if I solve it for C and for M, this is two differential equations. I will get the I and the rho, okay? And then I got the C from these two equations. I put it here. This is the current account. This is because the private sector assets are fixed. This is equal to the reserves. And I'm going to use this to keep track of when reserves get to zero. And that is going to give me the time of the collapse. Okay? So I'm going to need one boundary condition for each differential equation plus a condition that will tell me when reserves are zero and the regime collapses, which is going to be the initial assets, the initial reserves. This is the Euler condition linking the end of the pre-collapse regime with what happens afterwards, and this is fixed by the equilibrium afterwards. And this is when reserves are equal to zero. Better? So this is the equilibrium. Domestic credit is going up the same as before, but now consumption is going up and you're going to have a trade deficit to grab the reserves. In order for this to happen, the interest rate is going to be going up to justify the Euler equation. And because the interest rate is going up, the money demand is falling. And the difference between domestic credit and the money demand are the reserves that are falling. And the regime collapses after 2 years, which is later than what we had before. And if you look at the asset prices, this is a fixed exchange rate in red, and this is the devaluation, and then it grows at theta. Then the shadow exchange rate is this one, and it has a smooth space thing with the other one, and the nominal interest rate is higher than before. It grows, and when the money demand falls, there is a jump in the nominal interest rate. Okay? So an interesting question that I couldn't solve and trying to solve is, can you do open market operations by which you issue domestic debt, you make the theta equal to epsilon so you don't print the money, but then you have the unpleasant monetary arithmetic because you have to print the money later. But here, the interest rates are very high, so that might really be unpleasant and bring things forward. So, and change the real interest rates too. So, what is the effect of open market operations to deal with this is an open question. Okay, so now, this agreement that I described to you is very nasty because there is this point T that no politician likes. The real value of the assets of the private sector falls. Consumption was booming and falls, and then inflation goes up, and people don't like inflation. So no policymaker wants to be in office at that time, capital T. So you'll do whatever it takes to pass the buck to the guy that follows you. What we're going to do now is to say, I'm going to create an economy with production, home, and traded goods. I'm going to put a limit on the traded good, which means that I cannot import to get the reserves. And I'm going to put this limit so that the reserves are constant. So I can sustain all the Taliban regime, or the 10 years in which that was happening in Peru, or the 10 years in Argentina by putting import restrictions, and the import restrictions make the regime sustainable, okay? And I'm going to assume that you can allocate labor to produce the traded good and a home good that is identical to a traded good. But I'm going to explain you later that the multiple exchange rates are going to distort production, and they are going to make exports shrink. And if exports shrink, and you want to keep the F dot is equal to 0, you have to shrink this. And this policy with the theta bigger than epsilon is going to lead the economy to autarky, because exporters are not going to like to sell at the official rate when the prices are much higher. And then if you don't export, you cannot import if you want to keep the reserves constant. And the economy that is in financial autarky will go to trade autarky. And that's the cost of doing this. So I'm going to put two consumption goods that are perfect substitutes. I'm going to produce the traded good with labor and a neoclassical production function, and the marginal product, when all the labor is allocated to the traded good, is equal to 1. And that's the case I had in the Krugman model. And the home good is produced with a linear technology that has the marginal product of labor equal to 1. So when the marginal product of labor is equal to 1, you produce 0 of the home good and all in the traded good. Okay, so I'm going to assume that this is a budget constraint in terms of the consumption good. Now, the relative price of the home and the traded good, the way I rigged it, because they are perfect substitute, is equal to 1, so they are the same good. I'm valuing everything in the same good. I want to assume that exporters have to sell everything to the central bank, and then they have to buy the traded good from the central bank, from the government or from an intermediary. Now, the import restrictions are like a trade quota. So now I don't have that the exchange rate is equal to the price level, because I'm restricting the import, so the price level might be different, and it's going to be much higher because we're printing the money. Okay? So the government is going to force the exporter to sell at this fixed price, but then when they want to buy stuff, they have to pay this price. So that is like an implicit tax on exports. In Argentina, the official exchange rate is 800, the unofficial is 1200, so implicitly they are paying 800 for what is worth 1200, okay? And then I'm going to assume that the government is making a profit because they sell this stuff to consumers at the price P, and they only pay E. So typically, it's not the case that the government is making the profit. The government is giving the right to buy the things at the cheap exchange rate to some private sector guy that in some way is going to receive a transfer because they are friends of somebody. But I put it this way. So I have 4 minutes, so I'm going to show you the equilibrium allocation. So in an equilibrium, the marginal product of labor in the traded sector is going to be the marginal product, and in terms of the consumption good, you have to multiply it by the official exchange rate divided by the price level, and this is going to be smaller than 1, and that has to be equal to 1, which is the marginal product of labor in the H sector. So when this is falling, so that this is equal to 1 at the equilibrium allocation, the marginal product of labor has to go up, which means that the labor in the T sector has to fall. And you're going to notice that the marginal product of labor here is going to be much bigger than the other marginal product of labor that is equal to 1. So that's like a wedge, like a Ciclino wedge, or I don't know why I call it Ciclino, like we've known for a century that if the marginal product of labor are not the same across firms, you have a wedge, a Harvard triangle. So this is an inefficiency created by this implicit tax, right? So the total consumption is going to be the consumption of the traded plus the consumption of the non-traded. This is the labor in the home good. And then you can show that when the rate of growth of the domestic rate is bigger than epsilon, this is going to 0. So that means that you're taxing this fully. And you're going to go from producing everything in the traded sector to producing everything in the home sector. This is autarky. So output and consumption are falling along this path, which is my story for the coefficient of the barrel regression. And I'm going to finish here. Essentially, I computed the equilibrium in different models with a balance of payments crisis with capital controls. And the reason why you put the capital controls is to extend the life of a defunct regime, trying to avoid the Krugman moment. And I show you that you can avoid the Krugman moment forever, but that's very costly in terms of growth and misallocation. I have 1 minute to spare. Thank you. You have control.
All right. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thanks a lot to the organizers for inviting me, the NBER also, and the local organizers for having this amazing conference. I'm going to be discussing this paper, and obviously the views that I'm going to state here are not the views of the Minneapolis Fed. So this paper is attacking the issue of currency crisis, where the government pegs the exchange rate. And there is a very simple trade-off really in the middle of, at the heart here, which is that simple money demand, the fact that the there is a monetization of a transfer to the treasury, and just the lower bounds on reserve is enough to tell you that things are gonna blow up. Okay, that's basically Krugman's insight in the classic paper. And this paper basically tries to go through mechanisms to delay that eventual demise of a peg by thinking about capital controls and other things you can do, like import restrictions and so on. So let me revisit very quickly. I don't have a lot of time, but let me revisit very quickly the Krugman 79. It's such a simple thing that it could be done in a couple of slides. And then think through what capital controls are doing and what the model is doing. So I'm gonna do basically the Olfer-Rogoff's version of this in their book. It's a very simple thing. So take the Kagan money demand. That's the only way in which household optimality actually is gonna really show up at this point. So real money balances are a function of expected inflation. This is everything's anticipated, so expected inflation is gonna be realized inflation. There's a peg, so the exchange rate is pegged at some level E, which is going to determine the price level, given there is, the law of one price is holding for goods. Okay, so that's kind of a very simple equation. Now, you don't have to do this, but sometimes it's nice to separate the treasury from the central bank. So let me go through that. The central bank pegs the currency at E bar. So this is a special case of what Andy did. Andy had like a crawling thing, so I'm just going to make that equal to 0 because it's not really that important. And the understanding here, the central bank will try to do this as long as it can. Yeah, that's kind of the policy. Then you look at what the central bank does, and this is the other equation, linking the change in monetary and the level of money on the left-hand side to basically either the purchase or the sales of reserve. That's the F dot term is the reserve that have been sold. And X is this monetary transfer to the treasury. Okay, and in this simple model, it contains all the asset returns earned on the balance sheet get transferred, and there's some level in addition to that, that all that stuff is X. Okay, and X is flowing, is exogenous. That was true in the Krugman model, is fixed, and it needs to flow from the central bank to the treasury. Now, okay, let me not say this yet. And the last constraint really is that the reserve cannot go negative. Central bank cannot borrow. There is a lower bound on how low they can go. So FT can be negative. All right. Then it's actually easy to figure out that this, I think in one of Calvo's paper, I think he says it's trivially obvious that the thing is unsustainable. That is not the most interesting part of the paper, really. But just think about the peg situation. Is the inflation is going to be 0 because we are peg, so E dot over E is constant. So E is constant, so E dot is 0. Then money demand is pinned down. It's just real balances have to be related to that inflation rate, which is 0, and then that's it. Because then you go to the transfer equation, and then you just get that these purchases of reserves have to be negative. Okay, so the central bank M cannot change because that's pinned down, and this transfer of money to the central through the treasury has to be financed with the sales of reserve. And given that that is assumed to be positive, like Gandhi was saying in the basic Krugman model, that was an exponential thing. It means that the peg has an end. Okay, it's going to have a period of time where the reserves are drained, and that's it. The game ends, and that's pretty much just the intuition for why there is a limit to the policy. And remember, I'm only used 2 things here: money demand and the fact that we are monetizing. All right, so we know that the system is going to end at some point. Then you can think about what Krugman did. This is the most interesting part: is that there have to be an attack. Okay, and that requires access to capital market, international capital market. That's going to be Andy's point. So if suppose a situation where you don't have reserves, so the game is up, you cannot sell reserve anymore, then basically the change in money is going to be tied directly to the transfer. And that's it. That means inflation is going to be equal to the growth rate of that X. And if that X is growing at a constant rate theta, inflation is theta. So you're done. So you're going to inflate. And the price level is going to increase, and so it's going to be the exchange rate. But that also means that the money demand after the change in policy is going to be lower, the real money balances, because the interest rate is higher now, the nominal rate, because inflation is higher. And then the simple assumption of is to do the thought experiment. What happens if reserve were continuous, or if money demand was continuous? And then, well, if that were the case in this model, so there's going to be some period of time t, cap t, where the reserve are going to be depleted because they're falling at that constant rate x. At that moment, money demand is continuous too, but real money balances have to adjust, so that requires an anticipated depreciation at that point. So the exchange rate has to jump up. Okay, so the exchange rate goes from the flat level where it was to a higher level. And that's actually just the point of Krugman. That cannot happen, right? With capital mobility, you cannot have a point like cap T. Consumers are going to buy the reserve at price E bar before the devaluation happens, okay? And they're just going to exchange their money balances for reserve. So E cannot jump in an equilibrium. That's basically the optimality condition from households prevents this from being an outcome. So the solution to this is the speculative attack. So there have to be a point where we swap whatever is left of the reserve for the money balances that households have. And that's what the speculative attack is all about, right? It's this moment in time where we just run and drain the reserve down. And at this point, you can see I have not even talked about the other equation of the household. Right? That's not even mention it. But then you can think in the back of your head, well, the reserve really belong to the people. They don't belong to the central bank. They belong to the population. They're eventually going to eat them. So you can think about the consumption problem as long as money and consumption is separable. The consumption problem of the household is just to maximize the present value of their utility. So in that case, it would be to perfectly smooth consumption, taking into account that those reserves in the hands of the central bank eventually are going to be part of their income. Okay, so that's how you will close this. Now, capital controls, I'm going to do two things that are interesting. And I think actually that also tells you that there could be capital controls before the attack and capital controls at the moment of the attack. They are different things. So in principle, the capital controls are going to stop. I'm going to be make unfeasible for households to trade money balance for foreign assets. So that's kind of a restriction that they're going to do. You cannot buy foreign assets, so you cannot trade your local currency for foreign bonds. That's one aspect of capital controls. But there's another aspect, and I think in the paper they are both of them together, is that before the attack, also you cannot trade the bonds. So in the main assumption that Andy highlighted in this paper is the foreign asset position of the private sector is kept constant throughout. They are not allowed to trade that. That's the capital control. They cannot trade internationally that bond. So, but that means the capital control before the attack is also going to affect the behavior of the households. So that's the main assumption. The households cannot change their holdings of foreign bonds. And then that leads to different prescriptions. And I think that's kind of the interesting part of the paper. So one conclusion is that the attack is gone. So there are no more attacks in this model. The reserve don't suddenly jump down. They are going to smoothly be drained out. I think it's very nice in the plots that Andy shows that a level of reserve just slowly reaches zero and then it flattens out. And that's it, because the household cannot really exchange the stock of money for bonds. So that's a thing that shows up. But now, I mean, the kind of interesting aspect here too is that the consumption path that the households that rises in equilibrium is also affected. And as a result, so will be the domestic real rate. So now you have a domestic side that is being changed. So even though the households have access to reserve that they're gonna get eventually after cut T, the hands-on, or so they're gonna get over time, they cannot really smooth out this flow. So that is gonna affect their consumption choices. So remember from before the analysis, I only needed to do, there is a dot missing here. It's an F dot. I just realized that. You probably don't see it, but it should be M dot equal E bar F dot plus XT. That's the transfer equation. And now you have the same, but in addition to that, now you need to think about that domestic economic condition, the real rate. You need to solve for that because why? Why do you need to solve it? Because it affects the money demand. And the money demand is the one that controls the rate at which reserve actually are drained. So that's kind of the, so with capital controls, the speculative attack does not occur. There is still an expected discrete depreciation when reserve hits zero. That's what I was telling Andy, that it'd be nice to do this in discrete time. It's a little bit less surprising. And the houses are gonna react by reducing money balances and consuming before this time. So there's gonna be a trade deficit that runs. And now, it seems like a pretty bad thing because you really didn't avoid anything. You still gave up on the peg and you just messed up the entire consumption allocation of your household sector. And it just seems like it's a bad thing. So some quick comments. I think I have like -1 minute. See, on model cost and things that capital controls do, Andy mentioned some of these. Capital controls could be leaky, can be distorted, reputational concerns. And actually there is a nice paper by Delas and Stockman in '93 arguing actually that the expectations of future capital controls in response to speculative attacks is enough to trigger a self-fulfilling run on your parity. So it's a different take there. It's like just thinking that they're gonna be imposed might make you run today. So there might not be, and I think at the end there is an underlying problem here which is not being solved either by the capital controls, and this kind of highlighting this in the simulations, that is a monetary transfer that is really the key thing. So very interesting work, a bunch of other stuff in the paper, thinking about import restrictions and an exercise and didn't show on delay monetizations. And it's very actually kind of fun to revisit some of the classics in this area, actually going back to those beautiful papers and see them how they are kind of revisited and expanded. And then a suggestion I already told you, discrete time. And then finally, I mean, the thing that separated this generation of models from the generation of models that followed was really kind of thinking through that objective function for the government. You know, not only the feasibility constraints, but also whether you want to do things. And as obviously the next thing there would be to think about welfare. Thank you.
So let's collect a couple of questions and then Andy will have 3-4 minutes to reply. Is that okay? Anyone?
Okay.
Okay, so just reply to Manuel and
Yeah.
you will.
This model is kind of rigged so that after the speculative attack, when you have the capital controls, even if you leave the capital controls, they have no effect because since the two interest rates are the same and there is no reason for having capital mobility, you have the floating with the capital controls, and the capital controls are not binding because you don't want to do anything. So in this special case, my hunch is that the expectation that you're going to put the capital control later, I don't know what's.
No, at the moment of the attack.
I see what you
At
mean.
cap T. At cap T, you think, oh, now I'm going to do something to stop the capital outflow.
Yeah, and you still need, but you're going to still need to have the transfers there. It's not that just putting the capital controls. If you're not financing the treasury, the anticipation, you don't want to do any capital movement, so the anticipation of capital control that will not bind will not do anything.
yeah.
The key is that you're financing the treasury.
That is true. That is true. Although in that paper, actually, without the run, the equilibrium was sustainable.
Yeah, I don't know. Anyway. Now, the second question that I think is more interesting, these policies are clearly bad because money is neutral here. In some way, what you want to do is, if you're going to have this transfer, just let the exchange rate float. But notice that if you have a succession of governments, for example, like in your thesis, the equilibrium with the capital controls is a populist's dream. You have low inflation, a consumption boom, and if you manage to delay the thing, and your successor, that is the one that comes to fix the things, has to deal with the devaluation and so on, then you win the next election because you were the guy that had the low inflation and the boom. So the Ramsey policy, somehow you have to model this political equilibrium of why you want to do the bad policy. But maybe another paper. But it's like you have to bring the politics here. The guys over there have experience on this.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andy. Okay, so that will conclude our session. We have a couple of things that we need to do. First, we need to take a picture. So that's what we're going to do right now. And then we'll take a short coffee break and start at 4:30 sharp, the policy panel. So we can do the picture right here.
Claro.
Para vuelta no está, no es obvio que está.
I think we're ready. So I'm very excited to present to you this panel. They're going to present some ideas, and then there's going to be some open discussion. But I would like to say a few words about this distinguished panel. Tim Kehoe is a distinguished McKnight professor at the University of Minnesota and a consultant at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Tim has really contributed to fundamental work in international trade and sovereign debt in the context of general equilibrium models. Many of us know about his tremendous contributions, but I want to highlight his contributions to Latin America. Tim recently finished a book with Juan Pablo Nicolini on the monetary and fiscal history of Latin America, studying 11 countries in Latin America, including Peru. He has also been involved in public service in Latin America. He has advised to the governments of Panama and Mexico on free trade agreements, including NAFTA. And another piece of Tim that I know maybe closer than many of you is that he has been fundamental in training economists from Latin America. Tim has advised more than 100 dissertations. He has taught in Mexico for over 10 years, mainly in ITAM. And many of us have seen all these students that he's brought to Minnesota, and he has done tremendous contributions to Latin America. So it's really an honor to have you here. So Federico Sturzenegger, so he's a researcher, a professor, and has also been very involved in public policy. He's currently a professor at the Universidad de San Andrés, but has also taught at UCLA, Torquato Di Tella, and the Kennedy School. He was the president of Central Bank of Argentina from 2015 to 2018, and is currently an advisor to President Javier Milei. Federico has done important contributions in exchange rate regimes and sovereign debt as well. So a pleasure to have you here. Jose Dario Uribe, he's an economist and a policymaker, a central banker. He got his PhD from the University of Illinois, and he has had major contributions to the Banco de la República de Colombia, being a governor there for over 12 years. He's really been a leader in the region in terms of the inflation performance of Colombia and more generally in Latin America. Now he's been a president of FLAR since 2012, and again continuing his contributions to many of the regional countries here. Finally, I want to introduce to you Julio Velarde. He is the governor of Central Bank of the Banco Central de la Reserva del Perú since 2006. He's really led the very successful performance of inflation of Peru, and becoming really one of the main points of success for Latin America in terms of inflation. I was checking just before now, and the inflation in Peru is under 3%, is within the target now. Inflation in Peru was around 8% in 2022, so it's one of the few central banks that has been able to bring down inflation back to its target. Thank you very much for hosting us here, for your support, and it's, again, an honor to have you in this panel. So I will start with Tim, with 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Christina. Perfect. So I have enjoyed this conference a lot, and it's a great honor for me to be on a panel with such distinguished economists and policymakers. And as Christina has mentioned, I mean, my experiences in policy advising mostly came about because of my friendship with very good economists from Mexico who happened to be my classmates. And one became president and the other became the Minister of Trade and Industry in Mexico, and for a short time Minister of, I say minister because it sounds foreign, but Mexicans use American terms as Secretario de Comercio y Fomento Industrial and Secretario de Comercio. But most of what I do is advise graduate students. And I've been very excited to be at this conference because I've come up with lots of ideas for it, and we need lots of ideas. Back in 1991, I started with Ed Prescott, a kind of workshop. After Ed left, Christina and I ran that for 5 years. The last 11 years, I've done it with Manuel Amador. And we're always worried because we have more and more students all the time. We have 18 students working with us, and we needed ideas. And we got lots of ideas. Now I'm going to talk about them, but I'm just going to tell you a couple lessons that my friend Wampa and I learned from writing our book about Latin America. So this book, here it goes. This book was, this book was published in 2001. It has the economic histories of 11 countries in Latin America. And there's a little bit of bias here. It's they're the countries from which we knew economists who would be our teams to write chapters. And so they're all the major countries, all the countries that speak, where they speak Spanish or Portuguese in South America, plus Mexico, where we both have lots of friends and connections. And if we'd go back, we'd want to do some countries from Central America and the Caribbean. But it's based on, and originally we started doing it with Tom Sargent, but he has a lot of other things to do, although he's very supportive and helped to write 2 of the chapters of the book. And it was, Sargent wanted to really think about, and this is essential now, the relationship of government, monetary and fiscal policy through a government's intertemporal budget constraint. And I'm going to talk about that for just a couple minutes. And he was applying it to think about experiences in the United States in the 1970s and early 1980s with inflation. So we, let's see, here we go. And so here, there's 2 chapters. This, by the way, the research was funded by the Becker-Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago, and they kind of subsidize it. You can buy it through Amazon or through the University of Minnesota Press for $20, but you go to my website, you'll find 2 sites that you can download everything for free. We don't, this is not anything we intend to make any money from at all. But, okay. Our hypothesis, and we decided it was fundamentally correct, although in the book itself we note exceptions, is that all the disasters that Latin America has had since the 1970s, and there was a period in the 1950s and 1960s when people thought the area of the less developed world that's going to be most successful, and I'm kind of old, but come on, in the 1960s, I was starting out the 1960s, I was 6 years old. So I wasn't one of these people, but they would have said, no, you bet on Latin America. And then in the 1970s, that kind of dream fell apart. And there have been periods where in some countries at some times things are doing better, but it hasn't really worked out. And we think the whole problem is fiscal policy. Now, it's not always the own country's fiscal policy. Sometimes it's a neighboring country's problems with fiscal policy that gets a country in trouble. But in general, we picture its fiscal policy. And as Sargent is a big proponent of the view, a little bit of an anti-Milton Friedman view, inflation is always and everywhere a fiscal phenomenon. And, you know, we're really pushing that point of view. So I'm going to look at a government's budget constraint. I'm going to focus on what happened in Mexico in 1982. And as people know me, and you would have guessed, when my friend Jaime Serra and I finished graduate school, we kept doing lots of research together. I spent the summers of 1980, 81, and 82 at the Banco de Mexico doing research. So, I mean, I was there when all this happened, too. I don't have enough time. If Juan Pablo was here, he'd be insisting, Tim, don't start telling him stories about Mexico. But you know, this is when the lost decade started, and it was a decision by Mexico in August of 1982, the government of Jose Lopez Portillo, of suspending payments to U.S. banks that started out the lost decade. But I just want to talk about looking at this through the lens. This is what we do in the book in all of our chapters, the chapter on Peru written by my good friend Cesar Martinelli. We look at a government's budget constraint where we make it balance with something called the transfer. We know what the sources of funds, and we figure out the obligations. And of course, we know there's a difference between the primary deficit and the secondary deficit, the one that includes all the debt service. In fact, that's what Sargent mostly focused on. But there are so many things off the books in Latin American countries, and sometimes they account for almost zero in the government budget constraints. But in periods of crisis, they explode. And that's where all the government money goes. And that's something we got to pay attention to. This happens in the United States. I was surprised by this. Remember a couple of years ago when Janet Yellen took on the task of trying to keep the United States from going into default for the longest amount of time. They said she was doing extraordinary measures. And I said, what the heck is that? No, you know what it was? There were health and welfare funds and pension funds, special pension funds for civil servants and postal workers in the United States that they paid in, but it was run by the government. She more or less stole that money along the way, borrowed it, but it wasn't official borrowing, and she was spending that to pay for government expenses. And then all of a sudden said, at a small scale.
We do that all the time. We do that all the time.
Exactly right. Maybe we could have learned from Latin America on how to do tricks like that. But anyway, so let's just look at these events. 1982 is the crucial year. I just want you to focus on two lines here. The top line of the obligation these are percents of GDP every year. Top lines of the obligation list, which is the primary deficit, and the bottom line, which is the residual. And you notice in 1982, the residual, and I actually know where most of this money was. It was the bailout of the banking system, they were off-budget items. But you notice that's explosive. It's almost 14% of GDP instead of 3% if you just use the official primary deficit. That's where all the money was going. So transfers, what are they? Sometimes they're on purpose. I helped write the chapter on Bolivia with two very good young Bolivian economists, Carlos Gustavo Machicado and Jose Perez Carillas. And we knew in the case of Bolivia in the 1970s and 80s, a lot of it was losses by government-owned enterprises. My friend Jose is actually a professor of economic history now at the Universidad de Barcelona. And he said, hey, I'm used to looking at 17th century Spanish documents for Bolivia. I can look at those, and we had friends in the government. I'm going to take a look at these account books. We'll figure out what those losses were. And he looked for a few weeks, and then he told us, no, there's no way. Because the people who came up with those books didn't want anyone to know what the numbers were. Okay? So, transfers, bailout of the banking system, poorly accounted for profits and losses of public companies. All these governments in the 70s, 80s had national development banks. They'd have losses. Yep, couldn't find them. Okay. And sometimes these things were explosive. So just remember that. Don't take those numbers on primary deficits to be very informative during times of crises. Good. Enough for that. Now, here we go. I have another paper that might be interesting. It will come out. We've been doing it for 5 years with Juan Pablo and two young economists who started out as research assistants for us, Victor Almeida and Carlos Esquivel. Victor now is at Carleton College in Minnesota. Carlos Esquivel is a colleague of Roberto Chang at Rutgers. But we look at what happened to Mexico in 1982, and we have a new theory on it, and I want to mention this to you. It's that Mexico defaulted because it anticipated it will get good terms from the U.S. banks. Why? Because there were high interest rates. What was crucial was not, and we're not the first people to make this point, in the standard kind of model, I'll call Christina's model now, the standard model. In a standard model, you don't get interest rate shocks to have that big effect if they're not anticipated to go, if they're anticipated to go 5 years, like the Volcker shock. So we said, but what about the banks? You do national bargaining with the banks, and the bank's opportunity cost depends on what they can lend the money for. There's a really high U.S. interest rate. That's going to give them, not settling quick, is going to give them a big loss. So we put that in a model and we get it to work. Furthermore, we've done empirical work. Not me, that's not what I'm an expert on, using this data set and methodology from Asanuma, Naipault, and Rancière of looking at defaults that occurred in the 2000s, and we find you raise U.S. interest rates by real rates by 1%, you get an extra 6-7% haircut. Makes it a good time to default. Governments get to choose when they default, and they choose to default with high interest rates. Wow, I learned so much from the discussions and presentations. I'm not going to spend too long on this, Christina. But I was so excited, and I thought the organizers did such a good job. Today, I'm just going to talk about a couple things. But I got to go back, Manuel. We got to go back with ideas for our students, right? So the Lorena Keller's paper yesterday was great, thinking about how deviations from covered interest rate parity would affect bank lending. In fact, might cause banks to start doing almost all their lending in dollars. I loved my friend Juliana Salamo's discussion of that. She was also impressed, but she said, hey, at a macro level, how is this going to work? And I think we both started thinking there's general equilibrium feedback that's going to lessen that. And that'd be a great thing to get somebody thinking about. You did a good job matching empirical people and theory people for thinking about things. Pablo Garon's paper on hard versus sovereign default episodes, I was just fascinated with that. I thought Julian Kozlowski did a great job. I'm not going to go into his criticism, but I actually think what might make sovereign default episodes soft, one of the influences are high U.S. interest rates, because the creditors want to settle at a time like that. Matthias's paper on short versus long-run demand for sovereign bonds, it got me thinking about that. Again, I loved Jan Bai's discussion. I talked with her a lot about it. You know, all my work, I've always assumed if people make small enough bets, if they're diversified enough, they have smooth utilities, it's a theorem that they are risk neutral. So something must be going wrong there. There must be some kind of rigidities or non-convexities, and woof, we should get somebody going on that one well. Okay, then the last thing I wanted to talk about, this was when we started getting away from the theory into more models. I really loved Nico's paper that he did with Paco Buerta on sectoral development multipliers, but I thought, hey, I've seen that paper recently. I've seen it. No, it's not. My friend Yan Bai, with two of her colleagues, has a paper coming out. In fact, it's already online for the AER. It just hasn't been out published yet. And they look at a Melitz model like that. The differences in policies are idiosyncratic to firms rather than different across sectors. They don't focus on the sectoral linkages through input-output, but it's the same kind of Melitz model with losses come from the wrong firms doing things, whether it's upgrading technology or, in the case of your China paper, Yen, exporting. That's a rich topic to be working on, and we got to get some people doing it, Manuel.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
¿Me pasas?
Next, we're going to hear some remarks from Federico.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the NBER, to Christina, to my co-panelists for making this possible. They told me this was a panel on fiscal and monetary policy in emerging markets. Is that correct?
Right.
So I decided I was going to do two things. I was going to do four things. First, I was going to do two random comments. Then I'm going to set up a puzzle. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about fiscal policy with Milei, okay, which I think you'll find interesting to learn about, okay? So my first comment starts with a question. And the question is, why is it the case that the interest rate in the US went basically from 0 to 5 and we didn't have turmoil in emerging market asset class? Because typically, whenever you have 5%, it was a big mess, correct? So I think that's a question. And the answer I would like to postulate is that in the US, after 40 years of low inflation, countries started getting used to issuing long-term debt in dollars at a fixed rate, not at a variable rate like it was in the 70s. And this means that whenever the interest rate goes up, you have like a flow and a stock effect. The flow effect is what we talk about, no? Interest rate goes up, everybody flies to quality, the money goes out, it's a mess. But this time, it's compensated by a stock effect, which is that the reason the interest rate is going up in the US is that inflation is going up in the US. And with constant real exchange rate, that means that the nominal GDP in dollars of the countries are going up with US inflation. And that means that the real burden of debt is actually falling. So you have a flow and you have a stock. So let me just show you a graph. This is a graph of the gains that each country, so we computed kind of this gain for all the countries in the world. And this is the gain that they had as a percentage of GDP from the debt dilution of US inflation, which compensates the effect on debt. So of course, well, look, Tim, you have United States there, because I think in your transfers, you should add something else, which is that when you have nominal debt and you have inflation, you have basically a positive fiscal result, which is basically the reduction in the real value of that debt, correct? In the case of the US, that's huge. Then you see Lebanon, Venezuela. I mean, you have a bunch of countries. So I think this is kind of a first idea that maybe this explains why this time was a little bit different with emerging market debt. Of course, you have the counter, which is that this US inflation means also that a lot of countries have US assets, correct? And they have US debt, and they have US currency. to the US inflation also dilutes the value of those assets. So you have something on the liability side, typically for the governments, and you have something on the asset side. This graph here shows in the upper graph is the nominal value. So see that the two largest countries that have paid US inflation are Japan and China. Obviously, they have the large stock of US Treasury bills. But when you go below, you have it as a percentage of GDP. And then you see that, for example, Argentina has paid a cost from US inflation of about 3% of GDP. The same thing for Cambodia, which is a dollarized country. Okay, so these countries, or Hong Kong, these countries which have a lot of dollars, assets or dollar bills. In the case of Argentina, this is interesting, no? Because we discussed the seigniorage cost of dollarization, but we actually pay a seigniorage cost from not having a currency, because people save in dollars, and that basically imposes a cost. So I would say this is my first comment. The second comment has to do with how to think about monetary policy in emerging markets. And there's this very nice paper by Martin Uribe, where basically he says to understand monetary policy, we need really to disentangle what are permanent monetary shocks and transitory monetary shocks. Think of permanent monetary shocks as shocks that change the long-run equilibrium inflation rate. It may be an acceleration of inflation, and maybe a disinflation. And then you have transitory shocks, which basically affect monetary policy without changing the inflation target. For example, in the US, we had a big inflation shock in the 70s and 80s, and then we had a big disinflation, which was kind of a long-term trend, and then you have kind of changes in monetary policy kind of around it. For those of us who have studied monetary policy in the US the last 20 years, it hasn't mattered because we had very low inflation. But when you go to emerging markets, this distinction is critical, because it's a little bit like the Marx and Gita's paper. You have to distinguish what are transitory output shocks and permanent. In emerging markets, all these things get completely mixed up. No? What is a permanent monetary shock? What is a transitory monetary shock? So what we decided to do with a colleague at San Andres, Javier Garcia Chicos, we said, okay, let's take this paper by Martin, which was for the US and for Japan, I think, and let's extend it to all the countries in the world and see what happens. And his main result is this, that when you have a transitory monetary shock, basically the real interest rate increases in the short run. But when you have a permanent monetary shock, think of it as a permanent increase in the inflation rate. On the path to that equilibrium, the real interest rate falls. Or if you have a permanent disinflation, on the path, the real interest rate increases. Okay, so this is the result. This is the way. I mean, this is what comes out of the distinction between permanent and transitory shocks. And okay, so this is basically for the U.S. We do it with a different methodology, which allows us to expand this to more countries. But notice that these impulse-response functions of the response of output, basically, sorry, here's the real interest rate to permanent and transitory shocks. They go to zero, okay? Because this model is estimated under the assumption of superneutrality. Superneutrality means, remember what superneutrality is? The level of the inflation rate does not affect the equilibrium level of output. And coming from Argentina, not to speak about Peru, when they had the hyperinflation, we know that inflation is not super neutral. If you have very, very high inflation rates, it's going to be a problem on the real side of the economy. So we basically estimated this model. We extended this model to many countries, but we lifted the assumption of super neutrality. Okay, and then we get this relationship. This is a relationship between. I'll tell you what I'm showing here. This is basically the long-run effect of permanent monetary shock, different countries, and they're basically plotted. On the vertical side, you have the output effect, and on the horizontal line, you have the average rate of inflation of the country. And you see that there's a negative relationship, means the higher the inflation rate, then the lower is the long-run effect of monetary policy. To be honest, we were hoping that if inflation was going to be very high, this should have a very large negative number, which we didn't found. And when you have very low inflation, you have a very low positive number, which we interpret as countries with extremely low inflation, just having one, don't tell me I said this, okay? Don't quote me on this one, okay? But having 1 or 2% inflation may kind of help the adjustment in relative prices, so maybe that gives you in steady state a slightly higher output. But if you look at this graph carefully, once you move beyond an inflation rate of 5%, you have no effect on output. If you have an effect on output, it's negative. Okay, so what I take out of this is, guys, if you think you're going to do magic with monetary policy, you're not going to do magic with monetary policy. And I take this as a reinforcement of my view that monetary policy should focus on low inflation, and that's it. Get rid of the other stuff, okay? Okay, so those were my 2 comments. Now my puzzle. I have people here who work on sovereign debt, which are younger and smarter than me. So I want to share with you a puzzle. And the puzzle is that in the 19th century, the UK financed itself with consols. Consols were perpetuities, were bonds without maturities. And of course, it was the gold standard. There were no trends in the price level, so there was no inflation risk. But what's amazing is in this graph shows that typically the short-term debt was higher than the long-term debt. People preferred the long-term assets. And when you think for a second, in the real world, now today, people die for perpetuities. They buy real estate, they buy land, which is very long-term assets. And no government offers a long-term asset. You may say, well, of course, consols were wiped out because once you have inflation, they had a huge loss in value. But why wouldn't we see the countries issuing inflation index or inflation protected perpetuities? By the way, John Cochrane, I think, is saying that this is what the US should do. But I think there's a paper to be written why this was, Leonardo was telling me, no, that's the dilution. There's the dilution risk. So you want to short term because you want to contain the dilution risk. Okay, fine. That may be the case. Or maybe the change in the real value of this debt may be so large, if the real interest rate changes, that maybe for the politicians it's too risky, to issue a debt, and then maybe the price goes up too much. But why weren't these things happening in the 19th century? I mean, you could have made the same exact arguments, okay? So I think, and from a fiscal point of view, for fiscal policy, having perpetuities, I think, can really streamline and facilitate and make fiscal policy much more transparent, okay? So I just wanted to leave this for the younger crowd to discuss. So let me go to my 4th point, with fiscal policy in Argentina today, okay? We talked too little about Argentina today, so let me just put a little bit more here, okay? And I would say that this is kind of a little bit a Nike theory of fiscal policy, which is just do it, okay? Just do it. So the guy came to power, he said, I want to balance the budget, it has a deficit of 5% of GDP. So I'm going to cut the transfer to provinces to 0. I'm going to cut public works to 0. I'm going to do this, that, and we're going to have a surplus, okay? And people said, wow, okay, fine. Maybe it's a campaign, cheap talk during the campaign, etc. But what happened is that then he came into office in December 10, and then in January he had a fiscal surplus, okay? And in February he had a fiscal surplus. Well, some people may say, Tim, that there were a little bit of transfers here and there, but really, but now what I'm showing you here is the first 4 months of 2024 compared with the same 4 months of 2023. And this is the expenditure line, okay? So if you look at here, the primary expenditure, I think we have this kind of, oops, no, I'm not going to do that, okay? So the primary expenditure is 30% down. So if you would have said a government can implement a reduction in government expenditure of 30% I mean, that would be kind of pretty weird, no? I mean, it's kind of pretty amazing. The current expenditure, which basically has, you see social programs, that's basically 27% down. The reason for this is that inflation during last year accelerated, and pensions have a very long lag in the adjustment, okay? So as inflation accelerates, the real value of pensions comes down. The government has changed the indexation formula so that it adjusts on the basis of previous month inflation, which is something on which there was consensus in Congress, but as the issue of the laws in Congress was getting delayed, the government implemented it through a decree, okay? And so as inflation continues to fall, this number is going to increase a little bit, but certainly it's going to persist a significant decline. And then you have energy. You see subsidies to energy have fallen 40%. Wages have fallen 20%. Transfers to provinces have fallen 75%. and public investment has fallen 85%. Okay, so this is kind of what I think is interesting is that you do this. Sorry, I missed a graph. I wanted to show you a graph with the popularity of Javier Milei, because all these things have basically left his popularity totally untouched, no? And so he has an approval rate of around 60% right now in Argentina after all these first initial 5 months. And it's interesting, it really kind of, I remember when we did all these papers by Alesina and Reis in the late stabilization, all this literature, we were basically assuming that there was a cost in the stabilization. And here the fiscal adjustment, at least some dimensions of fiscal adjustments imply very strong popularity. For example, when you unveil all the corruption in the social programs, everybody says, oh, we knew this was happening. Suddenly someone is actually tackling this. And so I think it's interesting. I mean, in our literature, we have assumed fiscal adjustment was costly. And this somehow says, well, it's not totally clear. Okay, so I think that's an interesting thing. Now, how do you implement? So my last point, I'm 13 minutes, so I think I'm fine. Perfect. So my last point is, how do you implement fiscal policy? Who does fiscal policy? Is it the policy maker? Is it the government that does fiscal policy? Maybe not. In Argentina, fiscal policy is to a great extent done by what I call the blocking agents. The blocking agents are interest groups which influence policy and generates the policy. For example, in Argentina, the most important blocking agents are the unions on one side, which are very powerful because the legal system entitles them to around 3% of formal wages every month. So in Argentina, the unions take the equivalent of 3% of all the wages in Argentina. I don't know what they do with it, okay? But it's a lot of money. And then you have a bunch of kind of large corporation and businesses that, you know, and these guys, how do they influence fiscal policy? I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, the formal labor in the unions are the higher earning wage earners in the formal labor market. So they lobby dramatically against the income tax. So Argentina is the only country in the world where you can't have an income tax, because you have strong oppositions from the unions to have it. So you have to use all these crazy different, very inefficient tax systems. And the business, how do the business affect fiscal policy? Well, they ask for their subsidies, their protection, their tax exemptions, etc. Okay, so you have a lot of, it's like a Gruyere cheese, you know, the budget with all these privileges. So in order to solve the problem, you have to focus on the blocking agents, not on the fiscal policy. It's the blocking agents. And the blocking agents have a lot of power because the legal framework entitles them to all these privileges and all these resources which they use to move fiscal policy in a different direction. So what you're seeing here is, this is a photo from my living room at my house, where we basically, for a year and a half, we worked with a group of 100 people and we reviewed all the laws of Argentina. And what we were trying to do was to tackle the blocking agents, the income source of the blocking agent. And that means you have two piles there. One you see on the left says deróguese, for those which are Spanish speaking. Those are laws that had to be eliminated. And the other pile, which is a bit higher, is the laws that had to be changed, okay? And so in order to implement fiscal policy, well, you have to change the laws. And to change the laws, you have to write the change in the laws, okay? And these piles that you see here became, 20% of that became the Milei's initial legislative decree, and about half of the initial thing that he sent to Congress. And I think the government is basically engaged in basically this implementation challenge, which is to change the financing structure of the blocking agents to deblock the possibility of having a reasonable fiscal policy in Argentina. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Federico. José Darío.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here and in the room. And it's been a pleasure to stay these 2 years listening and learning from all of you. Well, those are presented your papers, those are comment, and those are making questions and so on, and the conversation in the lunch, dinner, everything was excellent. And also very happy to be in this panel with Tim that we met say, 20 years ago, something like that. And also with Federico, that was a governor of the central bank at the same time that I was also governor, and of course Julio, that we have been together for many years, even before Julio coming to be the president of the central bank here. We met because Julio was a president of FLAR at that point, so he moved here, and then we keep a long relationship. My comments are going to be very basic also, about two very specific points related to the many challenges, out of many challenges that face central banks. And central banks, since the COVID-19 pandemic, central banks have faced too many challenges, so many from many types. So I will choose only two of them. One of them, the second one, is related to the fiscal policy and something in the direction of the team comments. I think also that this challenge, just to give two examples, look at these challenges, just example to probably to motivate some of you to think in this subject are very useful for central banks. I believe that with the experience of the pandemic or this type of shocks and all this in the spirit, we have to think about what thing we need to change, what we need to adjust. I think, for example, that I'm a big fan of inflation target regime. And when I was the 12 years governor, I think the inflation target was very strong strategy and very successful strategy. But with these lessons, we need to start thinking in change. This is happening in some developed economies, and I think it's also must be also a challenge for central banks in the emerging markets and in the developing economies. Let me start with the first challenge. One challenge is defining how to face inflationary episodes driven by strong negative supply shocks. This seems this used to be very simple. I must confess that my vision when I was in the central bank, thinking about cases of negative external shock, was very simplistic. Basically consists in, first, we ask, this shock is going to be temporary or permanent? And usually the shock that we were facing was very easy to answer. This is a food shock, price shock related to El Niño, La Niña phenomenon. So we know that this phenomenon usually starts at the end or last quarter of the year, and it has the main effect in the second quarter of the following year, and then goes down and disappears. So the answer was very easy. This is a temporary shock. Don't worry. Don't worry is a word to say, because sometimes the impact was so strong and inflation went up at 3, 4, 5 points. So when you were in 3%, you go 5, 6% because of that shock. It makes trouble. Now I will speak a little bit more about this later on. And the second question is, what is happening with inflation expectations? And we try to measure the inflation expectations. It's part of the business in central banks, the staff, the technical staff, thinking, trying to measure. I think that we believe that we measure well. Usually we think, okay, we are doing the right thing and we know the calculation and so on. And with those questions, you very easy to say, okay, if the inflation expectations are moving, even though the shock is temporary, so you probably will need to increase interest rate to control, to anchor again the inflation expectations. That was the basic framework. But what we have seen in recent years is different. It's in some kind different. It's a supply shock that has been since the pandemic outbreak are much more complex than the Niño or La Niña phenomenon. They were a multitude of shocks, some of them one after another, or some of them simultaneous, many shocks, with difficult to predict duration and intensity. Surprising things. Starting one shock, starting one notch. When we were thinking that no more negative supply shock, we appeared the invasion of Ukraine and so on. So we're much more difficult to predict duration and intensity. We were not prepared. I think that we were not prepared, or the central bank in general, we were not prepared for these shocks, especially considering that they were accompanied by demand shocks and intersectoral demand transfers, shifting intersectoral demand. And this is for many countries, it happened that. I have a quote here from John Cochran, recent in the Hoover Institution seminar. He said the following: the Fed seems to think supply shocks drove inflation massively above the 2% target. Okay, shouldn't the strategy then include a massive effort to measure, diagnose, and respond quickly to supply shocks? That's a question that I think is valid. It's valid that we start thinking in supply shock, how to handle, how to measure, how to introduce in the strategy of central bank. So I think it's a valid question for the main central bank of the world, and is certainly true for the Latin American central banks. Although we don't know how frequently supply shock like those seen in the recent past may occur, it may be that we will have something similar in 10 years or in 15 years, or maybe also in 2 years. So you don't know that. The efforts of academics and central bankers to better understand and model the supply side of the economy and its shocks seems to be crucial. This type represents a great technical challenge, or you may think in some cases you may go to an extreme. You say, okay, I don't know if this is temporary. I don't know how to respond to that type of question. And the shock, if the shock is very high and you see inflation going up, you simply your response. One or the other conclusion, okay, we can do it. We can. I hope that is the right answer to think that we can improve the supply side modeling, the nodes in the supply, the shocks and so on, and we can do it. But maybe we cannot understand well that type of thing. Another relevant challenge is understanding the potential inflationary effect of strong fiscal shocks, and then defining the appropriate monetary policy response to such shocks. Fiscal policies are a difficult topic for central bank to address. It's politically difficult. If the central bank is independent, for example, entering discussion about fiscal stance could lead to politically difficult conflicts, while likely exacerbating the government intervene in monetary policy. It's something that the central bank seems to be tied in some cases. Perhaps for this reason, some central banks avoid discussion of fiscal policy in their decision-making process. On many occasions, this may not significantly affect the effectiveness of monetary policy. Usually it doesn't happen. But in others, like those faced by many countries in recent years, it could be very different. Let's look at an example. The strong fiscal and monetary reaction during the COVID-19 pandemic and the effects of the negative supply shock from the war in Ukraine, among other factors, increasing inflation to unforeseen levels. For example, the prediction models for inflation and other variables fail considerable and suggest the need to review them. Central bank, as expected, began to tighten their monetary policy, some sooner than others. With the expected lag, inflation began to fall, and GDP growth has slowed considerably, although it has shown resilience. At the end, it has shown resilience. The convergence of inflation and inflation expectation to targets has proven to be very challenging in various economies, justifying the slow pace or pause of the declining trend of the monetary policy rate. What role has the fiscal policy played in the last mile disinflation, in the last part of the disinflation? My intuition is that it has played an important role. Central banks fear that inflation will convert to a level higher than the target inflation, and probably something has to do with the fiscal side and its interaction with the strong previous monetary expansion. The fiscal expansion was an appropriate response to the pandemic, but the logic was that after the pandemic passed, fiscal policy will quickly return to normal conditions. This is like applying a war model. You do everything you need to do in the war, and when the war is win or is over, you have to recover, you have to move, you cannot continue in that ways. So this is applying a kind of aggressively responding to the pandemic attack, but also an aggressive response during normalization. See now, however, this didn't happen in some countries, and inflation and interest rate remain high. Central banks are attacked for not reducing faster the interest rate, but the timing and magnitude of fiscal adjustments matter in the capacity of central banks to stimulate the economy. It is a challenge for the academia and central banks to better understand the interaction of fiscal and monetary policy. Christian Wolff, a young MIT professor, has a recent paper on the timing of fiscal adjustment and its impact in the disinflationary process. It matters if I do it quickly or I do it equally strong in the future, but it's not the same. So it's basically my understanding of that paper. But fiscal policy may be affecting not only disinflation and its speed. It could also relate to the question of what the appropriate policy interest rate should be to maintain macroeconomic stability. Much debate surrounds that they have excuse me, what has happened in recent years with the so-called neutral interest rate, the R star in many models. This rate is not observed and theoretically depends in many factors. It is usually linked to variables such as GDP growth, productivity, risk aversion, demographic factors, and others. However, recently in trying to understand what happened with R star, interest rates are rising in understanding the potential effect that the strong fiscal expansion and increasing public debt may have had on this variable. Public savings have fallen in many countries, probably rising R star. The other component tends to move to lower the R star, but this one goes in the other direction, and we don't know exactly what dominates. Oh, sorry. They may be happening due to fears of fiscal sustainability that end up increasing the risk premium. To think that R star has remained unchanged since pre-COVID pandemic could lead to central bank costly mistakes. The use of R star in monetary policy decision is really challenging. Supply and fiscal shocks are just one of the many technical challenges that central banks face. These shocks and other factors can make the final reduction of inflation to its target particularly difficult in some countries. High interest rate in advanced economies for an additional period can create financial tensions. Moreover, in some countries of Latin America, the carry trade is high. Thus, as a strong and unexpected fall of the carry trade or other factors can lead to capital flights and exchange rate instability. We will look at some things about the capital flows and so on. Economic growth is low, and political and social tensions are strong, and actually are increasing some pressure in some countries. The political pressure for central bank to central bank to faster loose monetary policy may be high in some countries. Although local financial system remain resilient, non-performing loans are increasing in several economies, and the list can go on. Thank you.
Julio.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, particularly with Federico and Sergio, where we have been colleagues many times together in many of meetings, Basel particularly, and a lot of places actually. Maybe I should comment something about Federico. Yeah, we were little affected by the increase in the rates of interest. That is because the markets were never closed. Different from 1982 mentioned by Tim, or the Asian Russian crisis, or even the 5-6 months after Lima. What we saw 2020 and 2021 was less appetite for domestic currency bonds, but dollars continue being open. Actually, one of our greatest increase in debt was 2021 with bonds in dollars. And now we have returned again to bonds in domestic currency. Of the 5 bigger countries in Latin America with access to the market, almost all their debt is in domestic currency, so the dollar doesn't affect them so much. Let us start with something mentioned by Jose Ario in part. I believe that this situation has proven that having inflation target in place and using interest rate as an instrument has been pretty successful through these years. This in spite of the narrative that we see it in not only the Financial Times, etc., being some economists, saying that everything has been a supply shock. So actually what the central banks have done has not been so important. As was mentioned, a temporary shock that will return to normal. Actually, we knew it was a shock. We will consider our expectations. In our case, we have had 5 times since the start of the century, since we started inflation targeting, where expectations were outside our target. And this was the longest period when they were outside the target. Of course, our concern was how it can contaminate inflation expectations. And I believe the action of the central banks acting and increasing the interest rate has kept this inflation expectation well anchored. And we have seen that around the world, not only in Peru, around the world. In the other point maybe to mention is that the challenges continue being, I would say, mostly the same, in spite of some comments. The job of the central bank should be to keep inflation low and stable, try to assure financial stability, and something that is sometimes forgotten, to provide enough liquidity to make the payment system to function smoothly. I will talk about inflation mainly, and probably what we'll try to talk is what happened in the recent period. I believe there was some part of now complacency, maybe after, it was mentioned by Federico, after such a long period of low inflation, the great moderation of the 90s, Lehman, people were so used to low inflation that probably they took a little longer to react. Talking with some members of the Open Market Committee, some of them recognized they were sitting on their hands. But it was very hard to say. I remember you were there, I believe, you were there, by sure, at Jackson Hole in 2021, when Powell mentioned transitory. Yeah, some people criticize him, but he might have been right at that time. I remember December 2021 and January, inflation was so low that we believe that maybe in 2022 we might return to the target. Then came at the end of February, the invasion of Ukraine, and everything changed. But for a time, it seems it was temporary. Of course, there was the increase in price of commodities in 2021. There were the supply restrictions. The increase in the freight cost was enormous. Not only the New York Fed index of restrictions in supply, but even the surveys we made to firms, they were saying that inputs were harder to obtain, they were taking longer, they were shorting inputs, et cetera, no? But it was very hard to say. Then in 2022, I was surprised that the speech of Powell was they were going to act decisively to fight inflation. And I was surprised Europeans that were at that meeting, everybody was saying, we should take then this to Christine. Just this speech, should you repeat the same? I believe you were there. In our case, we had the lowest rate of interest of the region, almost 0.25. And we started increasing it in August 2021. Maybe you have started a little bit before, because probably when the economy already recovering from COVID, probably it was not needed such a low interest rate. But the problem is, first, it was still a recovery from COVID very small. The economy was still suffering. Second, we had the most leftist candidate in the last 100 years won the presidency. So there was some loss of confidence. We were a little bit afraid of what could happen. And then we started in August. We increased 25 basis points to 0.5. And then every month we increased 50 basis points until almost September, I believe, of 2022, where we started increasing 25 basis points. The last increase was in January of last year, and we reached 7.75. Our inflation was not so high as most of the other countries. Our maximum was 8.9 on June. Only Mexico was 8.8. All the other countries had more than 2 digits in the region. And we have started decreasing interest rate since September of last year. We stand now at 5.75. We are the country that is closer to the rate of the Fed, compared to 5.50. And inflation, we believe that we were going to be on the target. Our target is 2 ± 1. We were going to be on the target last year. We had some idiosyncratic shocks, avian flu, and some weather factors that affect inflation. And we are expecting for this month to finish inflation 12 months in 2.4. April was 2.6. And we believe we are going to be on the target, close to 2% actually, most of the next months. Our official projection for the end of the year is 2.2. But we expect the inflation to be fluctuating around 2 during these next months. The questions we have mostly are to one link to what Jose Diego was also saying. Until what level are we going to reduce the interest rate? And second, what we try to address first maybe, is how much below the Fed we can be. We have been below the Fed even 100 basis points before, but previous rather brief, 8 months. Chile has also been 100 basis points below the Fed. What we saw at the start of the year, and Chile also suffered that, a lot of derivatives were betting on depreciation of the Chilean peso, the Peruvian sol, as we were approaching the Fed rate. That has been reversed. Even in the case of Chile, they are now appreciating. They appreciate almost 11% in the first 2 months of this year. In our case, we depreciate a little bit less, 5%. We intervene the market after they depreciated 5% because of one main factor. We estimate the pass-through close to 0.1 So a 20% depreciation will translate into a 2% inflation. When we're trying to reduce it, when we have already anchored well inflation expectations, we're concerned that it will affect. And what we saw is that the demand was coming the forward market that was increasing week after week enormously. So we allow it to depreciate somewhat just to react afterwards. And we were successful, we were reverted in a few days, actually, completely with a very little intervention, actually. I believe that probably we are going to suffer some of these attacks, but I believe that it will be as soon as we approach, once we settle at a rate of, I don't know what, probably in principle, the difference of the exchange rate will be just the difference of the rate. But the betting, that in the process of getting there is what has been affecting us. We don't know if it probably will happen again, but I don't know. The other point is how low do we go? Our latest estimate of the neutral rate is 2.1 for Peru. What we saw was not in the meeting 2 weeks ago at Basel, but on the meeting on March, the discussion was neutral rate. And actually, most of the governors believe that probably the neutral rate is higher. Yeah, because last week there was a meeting of the people in charge of economic studies of the Americas Committee, the preferred will of Basel, and almost all the countries, United States, Canada, and 5 Latin American countries, also believe that probably the neutral rate should be somewhat higher. We saw in the dots of the Fed how it increased from 2.5 to 2.6. Probably the process of those will be increasing slowly, gradually, and probably they cannot surprise the market. Of the models, you probably know more about that, the people at the Fed. Because the 0.71, I believe, is the one of Williams, or the Fed of New York, something like that, and other models go to 2. Who knows where it is? But probably it's more than 0.71, I would say. And the second factor probably that is also important is inflation is going to be higher. And I think there's some sad factors that are pushing for pressure on prices. One is energy transformation. That is climate change that might affect prices. Climate change in any case will affect volatility, so probably we'll have a less stable inflation. And of course, a less open economy. That tariff applied by Biden. Trump saying that he will apply a 10% tariff to everybody and 50% to China. So that will affect, of course, prices at the end. So it might be too recessionary, maybe to push too much to 2%. So probably we'll have to accept a little bit more for some time at least. And I believe what many of our countries have, Colombia, Peru, is not a point, but a range for a target of 2 plus minus 1 will probably become more common. It's so hard to, it doesn't make any sense. What people want is inflation low and stable, whether it's 2.1 or 1.9 or 2.2. So probably give some leeway so as to adapt, no? The other point I want to mention is that I believe in all the countries that have increased the interest rates, inflation is going to come down. It might take a little bit longer. In our case, it happened also, but it happens almost all developed countries. This first quarter was a surprise. Inflation was somewhat picking up again compared to the end of last year. There are a lot of factors. I believe energy is also part of that. We had a decrease in the price of energy last year, an increase in the first 3 months. Now energy is more stable. We have, in the case of the United States, shelter continues having a great weight, but it's going to come down, might take a little bit longer. Probably in the next 2 months, Canada, United Kingdom, European Union are going to reduce their interest rates. And I don't know the Fed, but maybe September, and probably 2 or 3 reductions will not be surprising. The inflation is coming down. I believe all central bankers are confident inflation is going to come down. It may take a little bit longer. Inflation might finish not in 2% but in 2.3, 2.2, but they are pretty confident inflation coming down. And I believe that is a tribute to the monetary policy is working. Just, I don't know how much time I have. Yeah, just to finish, I mentioned some of the aspects that are typical of the central banks, the obvious one. I believe that many times the central bank has been charged to too many other factors. When the central bank was the only player in town, particularly after Lehman, almost there was a pressure, you have to do something more. Even not leaving time for the thing to react. And also the other point was mentioned indirectly by Jose Ario, fiscal policy was not so active after COVID, but excuse me, after Lehman. At first, of course, Obama pushed something, even the end of Bush after Lehman, but just after Lehman, but the next year, you had fiscal policy was not active, and they could not have any fiscal policy to support. What happened this time is that fiscal policy was very active, and probably contributed in part to having inflation. And just to finish, of course, there are elements of demand. If it was just a supply shock and the demand was not there, you would have had a recession. Instead, you have a very strong growth. No? And I believe I am in time. No? Thank you.
Thank you very much for these very interesting comments. We've heard about the interactions of fiscal and monetary policy, the risks that are coming from these interactions. This is what Tim was saying. The importance of inflation expectations and that as a risk for central banks. Special interest groups coming in and affecting both fiscal policy and monetary policy, bringing more challenges for policymakers. And all these external conditions, commodity prices moving in U.S. monetary policy, etc. So a lot of challenges for emerging markets. I want to open up for questions from the floor to get to any of our panelists. Yes, Mark.
So just, the way I've thought about inflation is the way Tim was talking, like the way Sargent taught us that ultimately there's a fiscal side to this. The other aspect is people say, well, institutions matter, make a central bank independent, and that will be what you need to do. But at some point, when an economy needs to undergo austerity, and they're cutting pensions, like Freddie was saying, or cutting this or that, seniors seems very attractive. How does the political economy work in Latin America now when these kinds of issues come up where they need financing, like maybe even during COVID when there's a big fiscal shock? Seniors seems very readily available.
So that question coming from Argentina.
Maybe
Okay.
Julio, okay, and then let's take this.
Yes. Actually, we had a fiscal surplus after stabilization also very strong. And actually, since August 1990, we had never lent to the government. And there was never any pressure from the government towards the central bank to lend. At least now it's unthinkable. Of course, that might change in 6-7 years, I don't know. But at least since 1990, it has been completely unthinkable of the government asking the central bank to finance it. Of course, we can buy central bank treasury bonds, but for liquidity management, nothing else. And even we have a ceiling of how much we can buy, which is 5% of the monetary base. And we have never used it to finance the government at all. No? The government till now has access to the market. So actually, I don't see a need. If the market closes and they have access to financing, maybe there might be some pressure. But if you have access to the market, as at least the bigger countries of Latin America with low inflation at the same time have access to the market without much problem. as you cannot imagine. Belgium, it's unthinkable. But it depends, of course, you are never protected. I cannot answer your question.
Thank you. Yes,
Let me
Roberto?
finish.
Yes.
Jose Dario, every time there was an election, he increased the interest rate. It seems he made it on purpose, in spite of the criticism of the incumbent president.
Roberto?
Let me insist a little bit about the role of the institutions. I mean, people talk a lot about the fact that part of the macroeconomic success of Peru and other countries is due to the fact of that the central bank is formally independent, as given, for example, in Peru in the Constitution of 1993. But legal independence is probably, in my humble experience, maybe there is something else, which is there is the culture or the consensus that independence, leaving the central bank to pursue a number of objectives such as price stability is fundamental, right? And so I would like to get your comments about this. This is important. For example, I guess earlier, Julio Velarde was mentioning, well, in 1990, there was the consensus among economists that fiscal discipline, for example, was basic, was fundamental, right? And partly this was because all other alternatives had failed, right? And I was wondering, well, this consensus was crystallized in this legal institution, but without the consensus itself, the legal institution would have not been durable or effective. I wanted to hear your
Thank you.
thoughts about it.
Maybe Federico can start and some challenges and
No, I definitely think the institutional is key, and maybe I'm going to illustrate it with a personal story. And the personal story is that when we came to government in 2015, Macri said, Federico, why don't we pass a law for the independence of the central bank? And I answered to him that in Argentina, laws kind of mean nothing. One thing is in the constitution, okay, but the law means nothing. We had a convertibility law, and then one day the government came and woke up and said there's no more convertibility, and the central bank can finance the government again, etc., etc. So I said, you want to bring down inflation? I want to bring down inflation. Let's bring down inflation, and then society will ask for the institutional framework. And basically the model I hadn't had was Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher brings down inflation in the 1980s, and then it's Tony Blair who actually grants the Bank of England its current charter with an independent. I remember I told this story in a dinner to Agustin Carsten, and he kind of said, no, how did you do that? Because he said the institutional is not a black or white. You're going to be faced situations where it's a gray area. I'm talking making a law for the independence of, if you have it in the Constitution, I think these two gentlemen here had, I think that gives them much more strength. But even in a law, he said at some point you're going to have something which is on the margin. Yeah, maybe the government wants to push monetary policy a little bit, and if you don't have at least that backing, you're going to be in a weaker position to defend the independence of the central bank. And actually 2 years after, that situation happened. So I think it's fundamental. I mean, whatever you have at hand, which is institutional, take it. Okay, that would be my lesson to the younger guys here in the crowd. Okay.
thank you. Maybe some thoughts, Jose Dario?
Yeah, very, very short. Colombia is a country that had, we talk about Colombia, it's my country. It has almost 30 years of moderate inflation between 20 and 30%. So it's the typical country that appears in the paper of the early 90s, I think, of Fisher and Dorbush, with moderate inflation. And that moderate inflation was creating a lot of indexation mechanisms. And the society seems to think that inflation didn't make any harm. It was initially unpopular to say that inflation was very costly. People say, okay, we don't feel it, we don't feel it. It came the new constitution in 1991, gave the independence. It was a very difficult to struggle on the disinflation, but then during this century, inflation went down. And the society changed totally. It's very sensitive to inflation. So when inflation has been shocked by even for food prices or niño, people really feel bad. So all this to say that formal independence is very important, but the support of the population is key. It's something very, very key. And the support, you get it when you have the inflation down and for a period, and people start saying, okay, this is another world. We live much better with this. We live with 20 or 30% inflation. We never had hyperinflation with some other country, but moved between 20 and 30, and they say, okay, we have very low inflation. Look at the X country had 300%. It has a period with 300% or with 6,000% inflation. We don't know, and inflation here doesn't hurt. But now that type of arguments doesn't play.
Thank you. Let me ask, well, maybe there may be another question. A question about the experience of emerging markets managing commodities, commodity price movements. So this is something, of course, as one of our main exports here, being metals or oil, that having effects on inflation, and then the experience managing. I think that in the United States, we've had that experience more recently, and there is sort of less experience on that front. So just if you can comment on those sort of moments, maybe the Ukraine war, for example, was a situation where sort of the commodities was maybe causing some of the inflation, and sort of the thoughts on the reaction on that.
Of course, it causes inflation.
Yeah.
I'm also deviation from the target in this century has been commodity prices, energy and food. In 2008, 2015, every year we have the furious. And how do we react if we believe that it's going to be very short and inflation and expectation are going to be contaminated? But we will react very mildly. We have to have basis points increase, and nothing more. The problem is when there is a big increase in prices and you are full of money because of the prices, the problem is not the influx of commodity exports. Is that since you see more richer, a lot of influx also coming in. We saw that in the period, in many of the countries actually, saw that in the period of the Lima, after March 2009, after the low performance of China in the fourth quarter, and their excellent performance in the first quarter of 2009, and after their currency settled, after the swap line to Korea, Singapore, Brazil, and Mexico, actually you saw a big increase in inflows, an increase in the price of commodities. We have the bull years in almost all the commodities exported in South America, and many of the countries reacting by entering the market so as to step back to quick appreciation for many factors. So a good part of the reserves that we have not been intended to be as reserves. They were a consequence of intervening when it was appreciated too strongly. It has been the case in many of the countries. What we saw also, and there is a concern, and maybe I should have dealt with that in the policy. You have a lot of people betting on the non-tradable sector, real estate, for example, because you are appreciating and the prices are increasing because you're in boom. So real estate and it is domestic currency, but increasing much more in foreign currency. You attract a lot of capital. What we have learned is that the financial cycles at the end will cause a recession that boom will finish. So we try to manage that financial cycles as to that be so expansionary. But I am talking too much. It was a brief
Thank you.
question.
No.
Answer.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Any other final question? Yes. Pablo?
So, what are your thoughts on an extreme form of bank independence, like a dollarization in Ecuador?
Maybe Federico.
It's a general question. Anyone that wants
Well,
to pick up.
it's interesting. There's been a lot of debate in Argentina about that, and I mean the pros are clear, no? I mean, we cannot commit to this. It's a way of kind of generating an institutional framework. The cons are also clear. You're left with the exchange rate. You lose the exchange rate as an adjustment mechanism. Maybe the comment I would like to make is that my views have changed a little bit on the seniorage issue, because you also have the seniorage, no? And I made a comment today, which is that not having this high inflation also imposes a very high seniorage cost in Argentina, because Argentines save in dollar cash, and they also pay the seniorage cost. So it's not so clear to me that going to a dollarization is going to increase that seniorage cost. Of course, you have the growth and the increase. But then the other thing is that Argentina basically has eliminated the use of cash. Not completely, but I mean, today the economy uses 30% of the cash that it used when I was a governor of the central bank. And so the seniorage cost of not having cash also allows you to save on the seniorage cost of dollarization, correct? So I think we need to think about, this is what I would maybe like to add here, that when you have economies which are relatively more cashless, it changes our relative cost benefit. I mean, at least the relative cost of the seniors, which was one dimension which, in my case, for example, I thought it was a very important issue that kind of spoke against dollarization, correct? Now I think that cost is not so large, and well, the other two are still there, correct?
Thank you. Maybe a final question.
Yes, it's to Federico. You had shown us what happening with the primary expenditure, but what is happening with the revenues? I mean, the recent reduction in inflation rate has going to have a payoff. What I mean is it large or expected to be large, the Olivera Tanz effects?
Well, it's interesting, no? Because this fiscal surplus has happened with a relatively large, steep recession. So that means that as the economy recovers, I think fiscal numbers will increase. And also in these 4 months, the adjustment in tariffs only happened in April. So the reduction in the energy subsidies kind of came at the end of these 4 months. Now the government is a little bit, to change taxes, you need Congress. And the government has a very little representation in Congress. So the only tax that it had some leverage to change was trade taxes. So it had to increase trade taxes coming into the government, which I think is not something that the government would have wanted to do. But I mean, right now, everything is conditional on getting the surplus. So you leave all your ideas aside as long as you get the surplus. As I say, look, I'm a pretty orthodox guy, but Milei is kind of off my charts. I can't find him, okay? I mean, I look in my scale, he's kind of off in terms of his obsession with fiscal surplus. And then there was a particular challenge because Argentina, I think it's an interesting case. In the last 3 months of the campaign, Argentina wiped out the personal income tax. And this is not a joke, okay? This is so the candidate came and said, let's bring down so people will feel that their wages have gone up, correct? And obviously everybody voted. These interest groups, they voted because they knew, okay, we'll help this guy win the elections and then we'll reinstate the income tax later. But it kind of didn't work. It didn't work in 2 ways. First of all, there was no reduction in any taxes. Basically, you shifted from the personal income tax to the inflation tax, correct? Because but the government now inherits a government where the personal income tax has been weakened, no? And I think that is kind of increases. I mean, I think that's something that has to be solved because as I said, I mean, income tax is I mean, you can't build a tax system within the income tax. But so far, to answer your question specifically, it has been the increase in taxes that has happened has been more on the trade side. But for the president, he believes that the adjustment has to come from a reduction in expenditure. So he campaigned on the basis, I'm going to reduce taxes. The only way to reduce taxes is to reduce expenditure, because, I mean, every spending is paid for, either with formal taxes, with informal taxes, which is inflation, or with future taxes, which is debt, okay? So he said, oh, you know, if we want to reduce taxes, okay, we need to reduce expenditure, and that's basically what he has focused most of his energy, as you saw in the table.
Thank you. Thank you. Fascinating discussion. Let's give a round of applause to our So this concludes our conference. I want to use the opportunity to thank first our hosts, the FLAR and the Banco Central de Peru, for their hospitality. Thank you also for the people that have been working on this conference, Carlos Giraldo from FLAR, Carlos Montero from Banco Central de Peru, and their whole staff, you know, everybody in the back. Thank you for the slides, the people that are helping us with all our connections and our logistics. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. The last bit is, so I think that we will have a bus that is going to be leaving to the restaurant between, the bus will be down there 6:30 to 6:40. We'll leave at 6:40 and will take us to the restaurant. So thank you.